Good evening, everyone. How are we doing? It's good to see you. I did want to tell you that we just installed the hearing loop in here. So if you have that coil in your hearing aid, it can be used now and it should function from this point forward. So I just want to make sure that everybody knows that. This is the last class that Dr. Turk is teaching. I know. It's been wonderful. Thank you all for coming last week to be able to hear him speak to us. And if you liked it, let us know, and maybe we can have Dr. Turk back in the future for more of these. It seems like it's been very enjoyable for you all. I'm glad that you've liked it. So what I'm going to do is I want to just welcome him up. This is his last class, and just so you know, Ken Hockenberry will be teaching beginning next week. So he's going to be teaching on a book, I believe. Or actually, it's not beginning next week, it's the week after. So 2 weeks from now. So we'll be off next week, but then the following week we'll be together. Anyways, let me welcome up Dr. Turk. Please thank.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Great to be with you again. I'm surprised it went so quickly, all those weeks, but it feels like it was only yesterday when I was here for the first time. And thank you for having me here in the Holy Week of all times. We're talking about other things, but it is wonderful to be here again. Somebody asked me about my handout from last time. I do have a few copies of it left. So this is on Chinese religious traditions. If you missed it, then you can have a copy. But tonight we are staying, of course, in East Asia, but we are moving on to Japan. And this is going to, yes?
It didn't seem like we talked about it much, but do they, like, you know how Christianity is here, so to speak. What do they do in China and/or Japan? Is church the center of their life, or is it more in the households? Or, especially for China, because I was trying to remember.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good question. So I've been there and went around. As I was there in China, I never encountered Christians in China, but there are many, and so. Right. So most of my knowledge and experience actually comes from Taiwan, not so much from China, but in terms of history there, I thought you were asking about Christianity specifically because you mentioned churches. So basically, Christianity came to China very early on, around 7th century AD. So long before European expansion, and it came to through Central Asia through the Silk Road. And it is fascinating because there are actual monuments, including inscriptions from that time, because some traditional Chinese ways of laying down chronologies of what happened are written in bronze, and some of those bronze plates remain in some places. There are even traditions, some of those bronze places talk about where Christian churches were, and none of them are around still today. Those Christians who came first to China, I'm not sure, I don't think they ever ended up in Japan, but those Christians were actually they were neither Western Christians, Western Christianity, of course, both Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, but, at that time it was still Western Christianity, and then Eastern Christianity, meaning Eastern Orthodox, like, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox, and so on. And then there are those churches which are basically, historically, they were never part of the Roman Empire. That division between Eastern and Western Christianity comes from the division in the Roman Empire, because it was divided in Eastern Byzantine and Western Roman Empire. That's where Christianity got split too. So, but there were many Christians in Western Asia, and they spread to Central Asia, where Christianity that they had did not come from any part of the Roman Empire. And so those names, there are so many, but for example, Syriac Christianity from Syria would be like that. And then there was this ancient kingdom called Edessa, which was kind of just on the border of the Roman Empire, and those Christians would send people to accompany caravans that transported goods through Central Asia, through the Silk Road and so on. They went back and forth, and they then established themselves in China. In many instances, those Christians later on actually became Muslim, which is kind of interesting when you think about it, because of Islam coming on the scene. But when Islam originated in Arabia, Christianity was already in China. And there are, like I said, documents about it. Those things are still being explored, so there are many things we don't know. But during the time of European expansion, during the time of world travels that Europeans did, of course, that would include the New World here, but also parts of Asia. That is when Christians landed in India. I talked about that, China, and also Japan. So from that time on, all those civilizations were transformed in one way or another. I think the Western world was also transformed. There are no intercultural encounters where both sides are not changed. It always happens in one way or another, but in the case of those, so for example, in China, Taoism, there is church Taoism. It is called in English church Taoism, but those are not congregations. They're not like our churches here. These are religious professionals who are experts in religious rituals, and you hire them when you need that kind of religious ritual.
They come to you.
It is arranged in some way because it depends what kind of service is going on and so on. So for example, some services are very expensive. So proper funerals, for example, are so expensive that people actually wait to have one big funeral for several of their family members all at once, because it ends up, and this is high cost for people who are well off. So it's not just, it's genuinely high. But why? Because a very major religious ritual is performed. And those experts, so for example, they perform that ritual in front of everyone, but parts of that ritual are really artistic. Parts are sometimes almost like parts are a performance that you would maybe see in other contexts, like people doing backflips and so on. but basically, the idea is that during those rituals, the master of those rituals, main Taoist priest, can actually command his acolytes to reenact what is going on with the soul of the departed person. And so they, in a way, can enter into that place where their soul is waiting for proper letter of pardon or letter of instructions or something like that, because on different heavens in those beliefs, there are different guardians, supernatural beings who guard entrance, and they have to be placated, they have to be appeased. And you cannot bring anything from this world there. So that's why those rituals can bring kind of ritual. And typically, in most cases, it is basically some form of currency. So in most of those rituals, I'm sorry, if you want to be, just like with anything else, if one wants to be a bit, skeptical, not skeptical necessarily, but just, to think about other motives and so on. But basically, if the family can afford that, then that ritual can be so elaborate and writs can be produced that are then ritually burned during the ritual. And when you burn them, they go to their appropriate place. But also everything has to be done, everything else has to be done appropriately. And then those pardons or whatever, they go to that place where a person's soul is waiting, and then so that is called church, service, but there is no congregation as such. There is no, so this is not your pastor doing. This is someone you hired to come in, and that person is known in that area to be able to do that properly. It is very formal, very structured. It is very artistic, and it includes many, many people. Like I've seen a few of those where, and some are actually, and there are also fractions within Taoism. There are many, many different groups. I've seen some in California. I think there are big Taoist temples in some parts of California where many Chinese Americans live. So I've seen one in Oakland. Oakland, for example, I've been there, and it's fascinating to see those services, and they are very complex. Yes?
Oh, and the Chinese, the village where my parents came from, that's where they have some of them too and everything.
Yeah.
And for us, when we go to the cemetery,
Right.
they're still alive because we bring food to them.
Yes, yeah, and we saw that picture I took. I need my pointer. But tonight we are does that make sense? Did I answer? So these are not, but and I didn't mention that last time, and that's why I made this distinction because of so much of my experience having to do with Taiwan and the political system in China is such that many of those things are alive and well, but there is also, there are other considerations that, there are other factors that affect how all of those things are practiced, and they have to do with political system and so on. But there were ups and downs, people who studied those things in detail, they talk about different, like for example, during the Cultural Revolution in China, situation was very different. So, you remember last time I mentioned people like Confucius, so writings of Confucius were, during the Cultural Revolution in China, considered to be backward, too traditional. Because question was asked, and these are not my words, so please do not. So for example, question was asked, why did it happen? This is, for example, Mao would ask those, rhetorical questions. So why did the Western powers come on their ships to China and try to colonize it? Why didn't China do that, right? So something had to be at fault. So different aspects of traditional Chinese culture were sometimes seen by the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party as suspicious. Why didn't we develop this new technology? Well, maybe it was because of our beliefs. So sometimes religious ideas were seen as not being where a whole country wants to be. So in that way, so they were not persecuted directly, or but they were ignored and in some cases mocked and kind of marginalized.
Well, it's still like that.
Well, yes, you're right, but certain aspects of that were, and sometimes those things end up being ambiguous one way or another. So for example, Chinese Communist Party organized those academic institutes that are basically cultural centers and centers of research, and they are called Confucius Institutes. And there are several in the United States, and they are all paid by the Chinese government. So I don't know, did you follow those, but at the University of Chicago, one was supposed to open, and then faculty rebelled and said, we don't want it. And it was people who teach, East Asian history and culture and languages who opposed them, not because they opposed anything to do with China, that had nothing to do with China. They said that this institute is Confucian only in name, that basically, behind it is something else. So that happens, if you look that up, with Confucius Institutes. But this was a big shift for the Communist Party of China because originally they would marginalize Confucianism, and then they suddenly tried to promote it by saying, we are the ones doing it. So Confucius Institute was picked as a name because Confucius is, of course, among most famous, most recognizable names that come from traditional Chinese culture. Does that make sense? Right, so it's fairly complex, and I wouldn't, just, you remember in my very first talk, I talked about sympathetic imagination. In many ways, any other religious view except our own, we often, it is so easy to say something like, my students say it all the time. you all are way more experienced with those things. But my students, when I talk about some of this stuff, they say, who can believe this? This is preposterous, And then, of course, we all believe all kinds of things, but when we look at somebody else's belief, then we say, who can believe that? So I'm not, at the end, we all pass judgment one way or another, but if we would begin our study of other people's beliefs by passing our judgment first, we cannot get anywhere. I hope that makes sense. And of course, you remember in the beginning, I also told you that understanding is very different than internalizing something. We can understand things. We can seek to understand things that we disagree with. There's no problem with that. I don't see it, So, and very often that actually is really helpful. It doesn't take away anything from one's own faith, one's own what you think is the way to do things. But understanding helps with that. It does not preclude that. But like I said, to gain that understanding. So that's why I'm not passing judgment on the Confucius Institute or on the Communist Party of China or anything. I'm just saying that this is one example of how throughout that period of 20th century and now 21st century, and I remember some of those changes, and there are other people who remember way more, things are changing. So the role that, for example, Taoism or Confucianism has in China today is different than what it was 50 years ago, and very different than what it was in the time of the last emperor or something like that, long time ago, right? So, but now we are moving on to Japan. And I promised to end on time now, but at least so this image here, you see this gate, the red gate, Torii gate. So Torii is considered to be, if you see one of those, you are in presence of something sacred. If you pass through it, you are getting into a holy place. That's what it means. It's a gate to the sacred. Here, you can see, if you look carefully, I don't know, let me see if my laser, you see up at the end of those stairs, there is another one. So it goes deeper and deeper. It tells you, talking about ritual understanding of space. So when we behave symbolically, there are signs that tell us this is symbolic action. You know how, well, during church services, especially in those churches that maintain strong liturgical tradition, when certain clothes are put on, you know that what is going on is not ordinary, everyday exchange. So there are certain signs, outward signs that happen that you know this is now ritual behavior. Does that make sense? So, if you see clerical collar or you see some other vestment or something, you know that person, of course that person can do other things. You can put a clerical collar on and then have a sandwich or something, but that's not what it is, right? It's supposed to denote special role. So this is how objects are too. So this object is considered to be a gate to the power that is contained within the shrine there. Torii, and this is so distinctly Shinto. By the way, Shinto, I have that explained on some signs. So whenever you see this is often, people use it almost like some kind of glyph or something, like small picture of it to represent Shinto. Of course, that gate itself is not the point. The point is what is beyond the gate. And what is beyond the gate is form of sacred power. Some kind of power is there. And actually, there are so many, it's endless. Just like you remember with Hinduism, there was this saying that there are 330 million gods. Well, in Japan, there are, maybe even more. Official numbers, I don't know. People talk about 8,000 or something, but that obviously is not correct. It's not meant to be exact. It just means a lot.
Same with the Chinese.
Right, yeah. So, teachings. Shinto is very old. However, by the way, name itself is not that old. Shin in Chinese too, it means gods, divine. And Do, Shinto, or Do or To is that same word I talked about last time, Dao, you remember? The way. So Shin Do means, or Shinto, means the way of the gods. Gods here are called kami. Kami. And so the way of the kami is what that means. Japan has long and complex history. And here you see actually people carrying. I don't know if you can see this well. Do you see that they're carrying? This is called mikoshi. It's a religious palanquin. It is carried around. In it, and this is something that as outsiders especially we wouldn't know, but there is some kind of ancient object inside. That's how priests, Shinto priests would name it, which has that power in it that they celebrate. Most of those kinds of celebrations, by the way, those celebrations are often done at the New Year. Some like this are done around this period in the year. New Year in Japan is celebrated on January 1st, so Japanese calendar changed. Old Japanese calendar was a solar lunar calendar, but that one was abandoned a long time ago, so during New Year celebrations, many of those processions are done. And at this time of the year, actually, the Spring Festival, that's the famous festival of cherry blossoms. It is actually a fairly long period, and we are in it now, so it is kind of auspicious to talk about Shinto now. And I will say, I have one slide at the end about what those cherry blossoms also signify. So here, something is in it. In many cases, nobody really knows. In some cases, it was so long ago that it was locked in a box, which is inside of another box, and so on. Most of those boxes are wrapped with rice stalk ropes woven out of rice stalk, and to protect it. What that power is, in some cases, in some temples where this is known, in many cases, it's a mirror, for example, ancient mirror, or some kind of sacred stone or something. So it's not so much about that object. That object is taken to be symbol, stands in for something else. I don't know, did you ever think about it, but when I do an action like this, when I do this, where do you look? Yeah, you look over there, right? So this is an example of an action that points beyond itself. We all understand pointing. Pointing, if a person would look constantly at my finger, they would miss the point. Because the meaning of this action is look over there, right? So symbols are like that. They point beyond themselves. So don't get stuck on the symbol itself. It's very important, but if it does not point beyond itself, it's not a symbol. Does that make sense? Yeah. People wear wedding bands, things like that. Before you buy it in a store, it's nothing but a ring, right? It's jewelry. Once it goes through that ritual, through which people change their social status, that's how powerful rituals are. You're a different person. Now you're married, for example. That ring, jewelry, ceases to be jewelry. It becomes a symbol of something. Does that make sense? So if you lose your wedding band, then you tell your spouse, oh, I'll just get another one. They might be worried. What do you mean? Why? Because symbols have those kinds of powers, right? So that's the realm we are in here. And by the way, when I say power, if you take, my example is a bit silly, but you all understand it, right? But if you take examples like this seriously, you know that power doesn't come necessarily from some superstition. It's not as if you have to sprinkle fairy dust on your ring to make it special. No, but we all get what symbolic behavior is because that object took part in a ritual that established new reality. In this case, it would be some form of social change of social status. And that's what symbols do.
Well, what if you're single?
Well, my example was just something that came to my mind. Yeah, I mentioned how in India, and this is true in many traditional societies all around the world, hairstyle or other things would mean, would denote your social status of those kinds. So here you have people basically celebrating. Most of those shrines are hyper-local. They are just for that one place. So people from another place they might partake just to celebrate, but they might not think of it in the same way as they think of a shrine in their own place. So here there would be a shrine in Arlington Heights, and that would be about some story of something that happened in Arlington Heights, and that would be your titulary Shinto shrine, the one that everyone who lives here would belong. And of course, if you belong, in many cases, you know, I'm sure you know, if any of you ever traveled, Japan is of course hyper industrialized, very modern, very secular society also. Actually, I have several Japanese friends who, you know, they think they would never, you know, they are adamant that they're not religious at all in any shape or form, right? But they also would pay attention to when in their neighborhood, especially if it is their traditional neighborhood, place where they were born, if there is procession like this. Because the power of that place is contained in the object, and people who handle it, priests, they undergo ritual purification so to be able to, and basically those rituals are done, like the one when this is carried around, to use that power to protect the whole place. So it passes around all those streets where it passes, it kind of goes around the neighborhood to recharge it, to protect it, because these are supernatural protections of the place. I mentioned kami. Kami basically is typically not translated in English, but it means gods or spirits. These are powers. And you cannot pin it down easily in terms of what kind of power that is, because there are people who, after they died, became kami. So some kami are people, and some kami are historical people. There are people who are alive, and they are kami. Of course, most famously, the emperor. And I don't know if you would remember history, you know, 20th century history, among other things, when you know, by the way, I will say only a few words about this. I don't have enough time to go through all those details, but Shinto in Japan went through many changes, and one dimension, one way of being Shinto in Japan was also very important during the time of Japanese militarism. So so Shinto is often divided in between sect Shinto and state Shinto. So state Shinto was a religion that was formed, and it still exists. It's still state Shinto, but it is not of a form that used to be in time of Japanese militarism. So back in 1930s and on. So basically at that time, and I was about to say that at the end of the Second World War, when capitulation was signed, I'm sure from history you would know those examples, on a ship, I forgot, was it USS Missouri, if I remember correctly? You remember, so one part of that agreement was that the Emperor of Japan will go on the radio, which Emperor of Japan never did before. So nobody in Japan heard Emperor speak before ever, except few people around him. To go on the radio and to say to people of Japan that he is not a kami. This was part of the deal, because he was one of those living kami. You know, power of the state of Japan and of its military contained symbolically in one person. So it can be even a living person, but many, and I'm sure you've seen pictures of many Japanese kami. Some are waterfalls, some are mountains, and I have pictures of those. So this means from people, you know, deceased or alive, to animals also, to rocks and trees, to mountains, waterfalls, rivers, and so on, the ocean, and so on. So really hard to pin it down. It's not just one thing. It is some awesome feature of nature, some distinct person or some distinct animal that has power that kind of pulls that place together. Kami are also morally fairly ambiguous. Some are very dangerous. By the way, the Emperor of Japan is considered kami because the imperial line of descent goes back to basically main goddess of Japan. I have some pictures later on. Amaterasu is goddess of the sun. You know that, of course, the sun is a symbol of the land of the rising sun. So Amaterasu, goddess of the sun, the emperor used to be considered a descendant of the sun, and that's why the emperor was considered kami. So here in this case, you know, this pelican is being carried around. People specially prepare, you see they're dressed in matching clothes and so on, and they carry it around to protect the neighborhood. Kojiki is a collection of writings about ancient history of Japan. There are other influential texts. Nihon Shoki, and you know that Japan, we call it Japan, it's Nippon or Nihon. It depends how do you pronounce it. So in Japanese, it is not Japan, it is Nihon or Nippon. So Nihon Shoki is basically ancient history of Japan. So it is interesting because those stories about how they begin with how Japanese islands came into being. They begin with the story of creation, but they seamlessly continue into Japanese history. So there is no break between stories about emperors, stories about politics, you know, how, what happened within different warring fractions and so on that comes in later chapters, and the beginning chapters where it talks about how the world came to be. Kami are specifically deities or gods of Japan. They're very local. So they are one and the same with Japan. You cannot, so, you know, you cannot really have, well, nowadays I don't know, because there are other places where many, I mentioned Chinese Americans in Oakland, for example, with those, you know, really lavishly appointed temples. In the United States, of course, Hawaii would have many Shinto shrines. So if you travel to Hawaii, you will see those torii gates in different places, and you will see Shinto shrines there, and there are kami in Hawaii. Kojiki describes the beginning of the world, and I have some figures from that book on my slides, so I will show you that. So Japan itself is a divine land where kami live. History-wise, what is interesting is that Shinto wasn't the way it is today before other religious traditions came into Japan. Actually, since I mentioned state Shinto before, state Shinto was established only after Christianity was, there was a period when first Christian missionaries that came there came from Portugal and Spain, and Jesuit missionaries, and they tried to establish themselves, but it didn't go as well as it did in some other parts of the world, because they insisted on converting local population on Christianity. And other Western traders came in later on. For example, the Dutch, they had very different attitudes. So the Dutch who came in, they said, we don't have to bring Christianity, we can do business with you. So they were allowed to stay. But the contact between Western powers and Japan was limited only on those nations that were willing to do trade with Japan without bringing Christianity in Japan. So in that time, just like Christianity was understood by Japanese to be part of a state in Christian, countries, if you want to use that term, that is what was replicated in Japan with Shinto. So Shinto was not state religion. Actually, for a long time, main religion in Japan was Buddhism. And most emperors practiced some form of Buddhism. And Buddhism, of course, by the way, you remember when I talked about Buddhism, I kind of focused on the beginning of it. I didn't go into details about its complex history. When Buddhism moved to China from India, it got transformed almost completely. And then when it moved from China to Japan, it got transformed again. So Chinese Buddhism is very different than the kind we can find in places like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, where you have this Theravada Buddhism, which is very traditional. Mahayana Buddhism is many different practices. originating in Tibet, in other parts of China, and so on. And then you have yet another version of Buddhism in Japan. When I say another, I really do not mean that Buddhism is definitely not homogeneous. Actually, in Japan, there are so many versions. So Westerners, when they hear Japanese Buddhism, they only think Zen Buddhism. But that is just one version. There are endless versions of. And some versions of Buddhism in Japan today, they look nothing like the original Buddhism. And I don't think, when I say that, I'm not saying this to pass any kind of value judgment there. Many of those versions of Buddhism, like for example, Perfect Land Buddhism in Japan, talk specifically about how it is too hard to be enlightened here in this world, so you have to wait until basically after you die, you go to another realm, which is called the Perfect Land, and there you can finally meditate in peace and achieve what you... So original Buddhist teachings are there. It is just this recognition that it is too hard for us to do. We cannot be monks, go around, begging for alms, and then, eat only once a day or all this stuff. This is too hard. So I'll wait until I go to another world, the Perfect Land, and then I will do my Buddhist. So I'm oversimplifying this. So there are many Buddhisms. Shinto was always there in one form or another, but it definitely wasn't there in its organized form in which it was remade only after the encounter with Buddhism and the encounter with Christianity. So many of its features changed, especially this kind of organization that we see today. Most of Shinto is about keeping some form of purity. Worst thing that can happen is some kind of impurity. And impurity, it is tied in with, what we would understand in terms of hygiene or something like that, but that is its simplest form. Just like with other symbols, we are talking about ritual purity. So there are ways of being impure that have nothing to do with hygiene or anything like that. So that is what Shinto is about. And especially when it comes to supernatural things, basically those powers that are all around. If they for example, if any power around us, sometimes due to our actions, sometimes due to some other event, if a power, supernatural power, gets polluted, it will spread its pollution on us. So we have to do our utmost to stay as pure as possible in that ritual way. That's the idea that has to be maintained. Strangely enough, we find examples of that insistence on ritual purity in many other religious traditions. This is quite common. However, it is often tied in with morality, with ethics, right? So pollution is another name for basically transgressing against societal rules in some form. That's what will make you impure. Or in many cases, many of those kami are, especially dangerous kami, they, just like in China, they originate from basically when somebody dies and then their family does not do proper funeral. That's how ghosts come into being. They chase people around because something went wrong, or if they die through some form of injustice, that means that they will never be at rest. They require propitiation of whatever type of transgression. They require this to be fixed. And of course, that is why it is important. Those cases can be endless, and then this is why it is important to have your local shrine with your local power and keep it clean, because that power can protect that, realm from whatever can come in it, and that's what those people are doing. It is interesting to see in Japanese history, the feminine, it looks like the oldest examples that we can find in literature, including in Kojiki. By the way, Kojiki is not like Japanese Bible or anything like that. It is not considered to be Holy Scripture, but it does have stories that most Japanese would find very important. These are basically stories about the kami and stories about how Japan came into being, how was the world created. But it is not considered to be Holy Scripture. Most Japanese would not think of it as Holy Scripture. So, but It does attest to the earliest stages of history of Japan. It looks like Japan was one of those societies where women ruled. So empresses instead of emperors were there originally. And it is interesting because their role was religious as well. They were not seen as political leaders only, even though they are depicted. I have one picture later and I'll show you. They are often depicted not only as empresses who rule in a political sense, they are also depicted as military generals. So they were in charge of the military and so on. But they were definitely also religious leaders. Mainly it looks because they were able to talk to the spirits, to talk to kami, basically. So it is form of, these words are used as technical terms. They come from another part of the world, but this would be like one of those traditions that has to do with shamanism, basically. Something is wrong, but nobody knows what. Because the wrong that is happening is not natural, it is supernatural. So how do you know? What do you have to do? Well, somebody has to be able to go into the spirit world and come back and tell us what to do, how to fix it. Those empresses could do that. So that's the tradition. In this sense, I said that about other societies. Most of those societies, and Japan is included, were heavily patriarchal. To the point that today it's almost hard to imagine. But at the same time, they also had women at the highest position, and it was because of that role of being an empress priestess type ruler who could go and visit the other world, the spirit world, and then come back and explain that. So good and evil are cast in terms of pure and impure. It is not moralizing. It is more about, do you maintain ritual purity or not? And ritual purity, in most cases, there are proper ways of doing things. If you do something out of sequence, if you do not do things the way it is expected for us to do things, that causes impurity. It has to be fixed. Some form of ritual has to be performed to fix that. So here is from Kojiki. Oh, these are, of course, illustrations that come. These are traditional, though. They're not kind of contemporary cartoons, but two main figures came out of the primordial chaos. They are the original parents. They are parents of all gods and of people. They are Izanagi and Izanami. And they are described in Kojiki basically as originating everything, including the Japanese Isles. So Izanagi here, as you can see, is steering the ocean with his spear. And that's how the Japanese archipelago was created. That's how Japan came into being. They are divine parents of all kami and of all people. And then the main goddess, she's their daughter, is the sun goddess. She's by far most worshipped kami, and those shrines to Amaterasu are in many places in Japan. Here is Amaterasu. This is drapery. Amaterasu, this is one of the stories in Kojiki, is here coming out of a stone. And this is fascinating because she is a sun goddess, right? So how did the sun get locked into a rock and then she gets out of the rock and other kami are beholding? Her brother is actually one who at one point did not accept the dinner that was given to him because it looked gross to him. He was repulsed with food that he was given in a place that he wasn't familiar with. When he came from heaven to the earth, he was offered food, but the food looked to him like it was something that somebody already chewed up and spit, and he refused it. And at that moment, he was banished to his own realm. And so there is one realm in which Amaterasu rules and another realm in which her brother rules, and that's the night, actually. The day and the night. So the sun goddess, so she's a goddess of the day sky, and her brother, the one who did not want to eat what he was offered, is the god, kind of god of darkness. She has another brother, I'll show you a picture. But this is by far, and that's what she's called Omi-kami, the kind of great kami. So this is Tsukuyomi no Mikoto, the moon god. Her also one of the brothers. This is how many shrines look like. And there are many shrines to this kami. This is how they look like. You see this wooden structure in front of it, smaller? In many cases, those shrines, first of all, you would pass several of those gates to get to a place like this. And right, they are like wooden houses, but basically those gates mean you are coming closer and closer to the power that is enshrined here. Shrines are meant to protect you from the power inside, and the power inside from you defiling it in some way. Impurities can always, cause harm. And basically what people do, there are usually, there's water somewhere close by, so they use a ladle, and then they wash their hands, they wash their mouths, they wash the ladle, then they come closer to kami. In some places, those structures in front would have slot where you can give some donation to the shrine, but in most cases, when people come close, you never want to surprise one of those kami. They are so powerful. So when you show reverence, and then when you come close, you clap. If you clap, kami will hear you, and then it looks at you, and then you're fine. Yes. So you don't want to surprise it. And then when you clap, you can say what you came for. People ask for protection or something like that. In many cases, those shrines would sell certain items that you can bring home with a little bit of that power of that kami. Many Japanese people, including many who swear that they are not religious, that they never do anything religious, have in their home what is called kamidana, basically small shrine that you have in your home. I have some pictures there. And typically if you take something from the temple, these would be actually very, very neatly folded paper with inscriptions on it. They look amazing. And then you put that in your kamidana in your home to bring some of that power with you. And by the way, those are done for the Buddha too. So sometimes these are shrines to the Buddha or one of the bodhisattvas. So these are not just Shinto, but many people have those in their homes. So here, by the way, those doors are almost always closed. I don't know if you can see. So there's nothing to see there. And even if you would open them, there's another wooden box in it and a rope around it and so on and so on. So it's meant to protect the power inside. You don't have to see it. But the point is that all those symbols, as you come closer, tell you what's going on, tell you you're in presence of something sacred, something set apart, different, not like our everyday experience. It is different. By the way, since I don't remember if I mentioned that, English word profane, when something is profane, you know where it comes from? Does anyone know? And by the way, that word changed meaning completely because profanity today means something very different than its etymology. Profanum, it's a Greek word. It means porch, like your back porch. And it really referred to temple porches in ancient Greece. You have sanctum inside and you have profanum outside. So, doing something profane didn't mean like swearing or whatever. What it meant is kind of business you do on a porch of a temple. Because most of those ancient temples had all kinds of stuff going on there. Like people would sell food, you could talk to people, get the news of what's going on in the city. That's on the porch of a temple. That's called profane, okay? That's where the word comes from. What is inside is set apart. You be careful. Don't just come in as you are. People used to dress up when they go to church or something. Same thing, right? When you go inside, everything is different. You are in presence of the sacred. Does that make sense? That's actually by definition, what the sacred means. It is something that is set aside, different, separate. This is what's going on here. It's that kind of shrine. Well, here you have several other kami. Of course, these are illustrations. Like I said, if you see those, these are from 19th, 20th century, basically illustrations. But like I said, if you go to one of those shrines, you will never see a kami there in person. And they are supernatural, being there, thought to be invisible. And the object itself would be something like I said, a mirror or stone or something like that. So inari or kami, and these are complex. These are hard to pin down also because that's a kami of rice. Of course, staple food, absolutely important, but not only of rice wine, sake, but also of all kinds of wealth and power because, your staple food often, well, we all know that with Christian rituals, with Eucharist, of course, bread, that's what it means. It doesn't mean just bread. It means staple food. It's like source of life in that sense. So same thing in Japan would be with. But here, this kami is also kami of the foxes, So it's foxes and rice sake, so all kinds of things. By the way, Inari Okami is up here, and this is a warrior who encountered Inari Okami. Inari Okami is here, and you can see a fox here. I don't know what's with foxes. I heard all kinds of interpretations, but you will see I have other pictures where foxes are. Maybe they were on some of those previous pictures. I don't remember. No, I'll show you. I have some other. So Inari Okami is associated with foxes and with rice. No, it's not clear. People who like to naturalize stories like this, they say it's because in rice fields, one of the worst things is vermin, rats and all kinds of vermin and foxes. If foxes are close to your rice fields, this is great because foxes will chase away or, eat all those animals that might otherwise, destroy your rice. So that's one kind of naturalistic explanation. I don't know, some of those naturalistic explanations, they make a lot of sense, but some, whenever you talk about symbols, things tend to break down. So it's not as simple as saying, what does that really stand for? And this is Susanoo no Mikoto, so very powerful kami of wind and storm. He's another brother of Amaterasu. So here are Shinto priests. They wear those distinct hats. Those hats are made typically from from silk, sometimes woven in some way in which it is, porous, very light, but then they are lacquered, so they're actually hard. Most of them are hard, so it's lacquered silk. And these are typical. And by the way, Shinto priests have several different, at least 3 different vestments that they wear for different occasions. These would be more casual, and then they wear those hats. They have way more elaborate hats and more elaborate dress for different rituals, so it depends on what are they doing. And here you see this rock is, you see this rope around it and those pieces of, this is also what designates that there is some power, some spiritual power in that rock. And of course, to keep it pure and to keep us safe from it, you have those. So this is that, himorogi is that rope that goes around. And those ropes can be amazing. And by the way, there are processions just like the one I showed you when this divinity is carried around the city. There are also processions where big rope from the temple, which normally keeps the kami protected, is also carried through town. People from fraternities, they dress up in a certain way, and they all get together and carry a giant rope through streets and pull on it and so on. So those are very interesting to see. Hare are those purification rites I mentioned before. Guji are those priests. Shinto head priest is Guji. Each temple has one. So these are ritual dances. This is Kagura ritual dance. They are a big part of Shinto rituals. Iwasaka, those stones like the one before. Ki, or this is actually Chinese word chi. We heard that last time, right? It is basically kind of elan vital, kind of life power, spiritual power. By the way, I mentioned Buddhism. I even mentioned Christianity in Japan. Actually, Confucianism came to Japan too, and Japan for a large part of its history was also officially Confucian, right? So many aspects of Chinese culture came there, but specifically Confucianism came there, so big part of Japanese history was also. So one way to understand Shinto is to think of it as basically type of religion that was there ever since the very first people came to Japan. Most of Japan, by the way, northernmost islands of Japan, they have their own religious traditions. Those are basically, people lump them with animism or something like that. In some of those traditions, bears are revered even today as main kind of expressions of spiritual nature. They're very similar to some religious traditions that you can find in Kamchatka region in Russia, which are also similar to some you can find among Inuit people in Alaska and so on, and also in Canada. So they are really, so northernmost Japanese islands are still different. These are miko. These are priestesses. They are usually young women that work in temples. They have ritual roles in temples. They also have other roles in temples. They're a very important part of Japanese temple. These are miko. Traditionally, long time ago, this is very rare, if at all today, definitely not really in state Shinto, but traditionally those were those women who could enter into kind of separate reality, enter into state of trance, kind of another state of mind, state of consciousness in which they could talk to spirits and so on. Like I said, by the way, you remember I mentioned earlier sect Shinto and state Shinto. So what is called typically in English sect Shinto are all kinds of Shinto shrines and traditions and teachings that are not part of the state Shinto. And this is actually very big part of Shinto today, way more elaborate with more rituals, more complex rituals. State Shinto is really ritualistic and it has its prescribed rituals and that is it. But those other sect Shinto groups, they have enormous amount of very complex teachings. Oni are those demons, dangerous spirits that go around. That's why you need protection from kami, who are basically powerful enough to protect you, but they can be propitiated, they can be turned to help you. Well, here I already showed this. This one is really giant to the, usually, it depends which side you look, but here you can see the temple on the shore here. This story is, of course, for at the high tide, it is in the ocean. So these are gates marking the entrance to, I'm skipping. Here you have, those are very impressive and they're really, talking about ritual space, talking about symbols. You remember when I mentioned those actions, like when I was pointing. So you don't have to be Japanese, you don't have to know anything about it, but once you go through some of those gates and so on, you feel like you're entering into a special place, which is really interesting. So in terms of universality of some of those symbols, they really work. Because you feel like there is a gate, you're passing into another realm. And of course, more gates there are. By the way, you can tell if you would, and here it says, even if you didn't read, you would be able to tell which kami is behind. Why? Because there are foxes, of course, on each side. So you know that Inari kami is on the other side, right? Rice and fox's kami is inside. That is, like I said, one of the most important kami. Well, here is this is Jingo. This is one of those legendary empresses. She is one of those empresses who was also military general, and she could also talk to the spirits. So, and history about her is described in Kojiki, in that book of sacred stories from Japan, stories about kami. This painting is, of course, much, much later. And this is interesting because Jingo was actually, this is her son who became a god. So he was the emperor who later on was divinized, became kami. And he was also associated with Buddhism too. So he was considered to be one of the bodhisattvas. And also god of war, because during his life he was a warrior. So he was very popular with the samurai. Many samurai would look up to Hachiman. But like I said, he was seen both as Buddhist, basically highest achievement of Buddhism, bodhisattva, pure enlightened person, but also kami. So that's why you have him here in lotus flower kind of. You remember, I think I showed you one image of Buddha also, be kind of one of those images of Buddha's enlightenment when he touches the ground. Well, here you have Hachiman in one of those pure enlightened person, but also someone who became kami. He was very popular with the samurai. Well, here is another, you see small torii up there, you see those ropes. Whenever you see something like that, it's a Shinto shrine, and those are everywhere in Japan. So basically, here this stands actually for Izanagi and Izanami, the divine parents of all kami. You remember the primordial pair, kami who created Japan. Some shrines are just unbelievably beautiful. This shrine is not necessarily what is holy about this place, even though it looks amazing. What people worship here is actually this waterfall. So it's a feature of nature that is considered divine. It has power. This happens, I'm sure all of you, many people experience that. I mean, first time you see things like the Grand Canyon, or things like Niagara Falls or something like that, we often get overwhelmed with that sense. You know, that word awe used to be used sparingly. Now it's everywhere. Everything is awesome and so on. But Niagara Falls are awesome. Or the Grand Canyon is awesome. So basically, it makes us feel small in a good way, not small in a way in which it would be belittling, but we feel like we are in presence of something larger than us, something that puts you in another state of mind. People often report that feeling that's why it is called the oceanic feeling. People report that feeling if you ever sail especially on a small, not those big, cruisers, because they're like mountains themselves. But basically, if you're on a small boat in the middle of the ocean, you suddenly, you think one thinks differently about what the world is. Nobody, in a small boat in the middle of the ocean, nobody feels in control, right? You see the ocean, you see the sky. That's where people report feelings of, it is type of spiritual experience of nature, right? That's what many kami, in a way, stand for. Well, here is one kami you saw many times. Of course, the point here is not the gate. This is really, I like this image because, you might mistake this gate for a temple. It's not, it's the mountain behind. And you all seen this mountain. So yes, Mount Fuji is considered to be a god, kami. So Mount Fuji is one of those kami. It's this is dormant volcano, famous kind of symbol of Japan. But it is also considered to be divine. Well, how to live. There is very little emphasis on morality. The explicit talk is about ritual purity. This is absolutely central in Japan, in Shinto. And by the way, I don't think I have any separate slides on this specifically, but in Japan, people who say, nobody would say, if you say, because it's called Shindo or Shinto, way of Shin or gods, the way of the kami. We call it Shintoism sometimes, and then I heard people use that to name the adherents of that tradition, to call them Shintoists or something like that. Well, in Japan, most people would not identify in that way, and they are not going to identify as Buddhist either, but they will have certain aspects of their lives governed by those religious traditions. And one aspect that is governed by Buddhism for all Japanese is actually funeral rites. So funeral rituals, there are no Shinto funerals. Shinto priests do not do funerals at all because death is associated with impurity in Shinto. So that's what I mean when I say it is not morality in the sense in which we might be used to. So insofar as people have religious ceremonies during funeral, it would be only Buddhist. So, and this is long history in Japan. This is true in some other parts of the world too. So Buddhists, for Buddhist monks, being close to a person who is deceased, you remember Buddha had that. Actually, Buddha, on his first trip out of his palace, attended a funeral. He didn't just see it in some of those stories, he actually went there to sit next to a family mourning person who was deceased. So for Buddhist monks, being close to a person who died is considered to be a very important part of their meditation, because it is coming to terms with one's own finitude. And the Buddhist monks train for that, which is very interesting. It's a kind of, I wouldn't make it so explicit if it wouldn't be in the Easter week, right? So Christianity has its own way of overcoming death. In Buddhism, it would be by kind of being as close to it as possible. And in Shinto, it's the exact opposite. You don't want to be anywhere close to anything that has to do with death, because death is a symptom of impurity. So in that sense, in Japan, nobody is just Shinto. People always combine more than one thing. And by the way, Christianity too, which is very interesting. So over the years, even Shinto appropriated some ideas from Christianity.
Well, for the Chinese, since my parents passed on, they're 3 years to their life, and don't, put on their, it means like past, present, and future, because they
Oh.
forever, how we do it.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that. That's very interesting. Yes?
If nobody wants anything to do with death and dying, I'm visioning people's loved one on their deathbed and everybody goes away.
Well, not really, but in a way, for religious purposes, it is dangerous to stay close. So yeah, people who have to deal with it are people who have to deal with it, other people stay away. So that would be Shinto way.
Okay, I'm not going to do that one.
Right, yeah. But it's when it comes to rituals in general, and especially when it comes to what we think makes sense, those things are so different all around the world. Well, somebody asked about some of those other traditions. I mentioned some. I mentioned how in Jainism it is considered to be a very spiritual thing to when one feels like that the end is close, then one is supposed to stop ingesting food and water. This is considered to be spiritual practice, consciously, to decide to stop eating. And especially if you're ill or something, that doesn't last long. But in Jainism, that's required in a way. So we would think of that as, it wouldn't make sense in another context. In that context, it's the most noble thing to do. So you see how, I know we all have those reactions when we see something that just makes no sense to us, but then, in Japan, it is that combination between Buddhism and Shinto that makes people's lives acceptable in that way, Talking about, I don't, again, I'm going over time, but somebody asked about some of those other religious traditions. I'm sure you all heard about, for example, in India, I've been to close to some of those places because students always want to see something about it, but I have contact with some people from India who are Parsi. I'm sure you heard of that. In their tradition, there are no funerals. They expose bodies, they leave them out, basically, for birds to eat, So that other people would, in India especially, where cremation is the only way to go, really, except for separate special cases. I mentioned that for some gurus and so on. But that group, they have their place where they, it's a kind of walled off place. It's called Tower of Silence, and basically bodies are placed on that tower and they're exposed, They cannot be seen, but people whose loved ones there are, they go there and they place them there, and there are other bodies there, and they're there until they vanish, basically being eaten by birds and so on. So, Parsi religion in India.
I thought Buddhists do that, believe in it too.
Well, in many parts of the world, in the Himalayan mountains, wherever, if you go high up, yes, that is because they call those sky funerals and so on. This is because actually you cannot cremate a person because you need wood, and wood is so expensive and so hard to bring, because people typically cook on cow dung, They burn cow dung. They don't burn, cow manure is dried up and then burned. They don't burn wood. because there is none, and you cannot dig because it's stone and it's frozen. So it is really the only way to do it. I mean, you can put stones on it. And in many cases, it is Buddhist monks who would then, in some cases, they actually dismember the body for birds to be able to carry it on. So, sorry, I don't want to be so grim with this, but you see the point. But just to finish those few slides, and then we can go over those questions. So here is the temple to the Buddha, of course. Here is interesting thing. That's what I mentioned. You probably, maybe you remember, because this was in 2017, but especially when President Obama went to Japan to visit, on an official visit, this was big issue. So, for example, during Japanese militarism, during Second World War, state Shinto was so heavily involved with Japanese militarism, and many of their generals and people, politicians, other people who ended up being accused and then sentenced, found guilty for war crimes, crimes against humanity, all those things, they ended up being enshrined in some of those Shinto shrines. And the current Japanese government is so ambiguous about it. For years, they would not mention that. They would not go there. Nobody ever went there. And then there was this big scandal because a former prime minister who was unfortunately assassinated just recently, Shinzo Abe, you remember, it was just recent. He actually on several occasions would send gifts to this specific temple where some of those generals who were part of the Japanese military, who were found to be guilty of war crimes, are enshrined. And this is part of state Shinto in that tradition. In this occasion, a kind of bipartisan delegation of Japanese members of the parliament went to visit the shrine. And it was so strange because their official statement was that they are going there to make sure that nobody will ever be enshrined in that shrine. But this was so strange because people ask, you go there, it looks like you're worshiping those people who were found to be guilty of war crimes. So which one is it? So this was very, because, and I mentioned the visit to President Obama, because in that, those are diplomatic occasions where everything is choreographed, where everything is ritualized. So who is going to visit what, and who is going to lay wreath on what? This is always decided in advance. So, of course, U.S. President is not going to come close to any of those shrines where, the state official state religion enshrined people who were, kind of really universally thought of as bad people, no matter how you look at it, right? So it's not just about legal matter, were they found guilty or not. It is just, so, and of course, in U.S., this was on the news, if maybe now you will hear more news about things from various world religions, but it was easy to overlook, if you didn't know what this was about, you were just thinking, who knows what's going on, some kind of hoopla or something in Japan. But for example, in China, this was big thing, because in China, because of the history of Japanese imperial, empire waging war against China, Chinese government saw events like this as direct provocation. They thought this is most horrible thing. Japan is going back to its imperial past, and they are going to resurrect their militarism, and they are going to, where are they going with this? So it is very interesting. So I hope you will follow things like this on the news, and when you see Japanese members of the parliament go into a Shinto shrine, it is not as it is not as simple as it looks, Otherwise, you would just think, well, that's their religion. Of course they go. But no, this is one of those shrines. And here is something with Shinto that is so interesting. Actually, we talked about it a moment ago. I don't know if you know this character, but I'm sure some of your family, they know Japanese animation. What is fascinating about so many of those stories, they are straight from Shinto stories. To the point that actually, this is Mononoke Hime, Princess Mononoke. Yeah.
What is that on her face?
Blood. She's a feral girl. She was raised by wolves, and this wolf behind her is that big, giant wolf. That wolf in the story is god of all wolves. Kami of wolves, and that's how they call it. It's Kami. And basically that whole movie is a story of pollution that came to the gods of animals. And then this girl, feral girl, she helps animals to chase away people who are polluting animals in the forest. That's the story. So it's a wonderful, this movie, I think this movie got Oscar or the other one. These are, Ghibli studio that produced this movie. They're part of Disney now. These are, worldwide distributed, very influential movies. But the thing is that, so if you watch that movie, you would think you're watching really nice kind of family movie, like I told you a story. But what is interesting about it is that everything in that movie is 100% religious from Shinto. So if you know a little bit about Shinto, you would see this movie in another light. You would understand this point of, by the way, a boy that she likes, who ends up being caught in those events, he at one point is hunting, he's a hunter and he goes to hunt for boar, and the boar he tries to catch is one of those gods of boars, kind of boar who is in charge of all boars, and that boar got polluted by actions of other people. And when that boy touches the boar, his hand, his arm gets polluted. That's part of the story. And so this feral girl, she's helping that boy and so on. I'm not going to retell the movie, but that pollution, you should. If you've never seen this, it's a really good movie. But the pollution and the ritual that has to be done to purify it straight from Shinto. These are 100% religious concepts. Another one that was so famous, maybe you saw it, is Spirited Away. Also, it is interesting, if you just like to see children's movies, you would love that one, and your children will love, or grandchildren or whatever. But the thing is that this spirit here is actually Kami, spirited away. It is this girl, she was abducted by Kami. And she ends up like one of those Miko, those priestesses in a temple. She ends up in another world. Her parents and she were moving to another area. She was so anxious about having to go to new school and all this stuff. And then they go aside to grab something to eat. And while her parents are eating, they actually, she realizes later on, they ended up in some kind of supernatural place, other world, and she gets lost from her parents. And then she has to work to survive. And she works in a bathhouse where Kami come to be purified. They go there to take bath. And so she's helping spirits of that neighborhood get purified. And of course, some of them are funny, some of them are terrific, like this one, No Face, she makes friends with him and everyone is super scared of him. So it takes that kind of naivete that someone in her position would have. She ends up, doing well, but what is fascinating about this movie is that so many people have seen it all around the world. Of course, in the United States, these are globally popular movies. They're 100% religious, 100% rooted in Shinto. And if you don't know anything about Shinto, you wonder, how imaginative, how strange story. If you know something about Shinto, you just nod and say, yeah, we got that. It's very interesting. Here you see, talking about rituals, here you see, you immediately know what's going on. Of course, these are Miko, these are those priestesses, but you can see here what's going on. This is wedding in one of those shrines, same thing. Talking about changing context by way people dress, as soon as you can see this lady here in white, with her head covered, you know what is going on. So one of the head priests. Well, that's what people use Shinto shrines to. It's not just for cars. So this priest is blessing their new car. So this family, they drove, this is what you can do in many temples. When you buy a new car, you bring it to the local temple. And then, and you will see in many cars, again, the same Japanese people who swear that they are not religious. They say, I'm not religious at all. They have, not only for your car. I saw in some of those temples, you can buy talisman that you can put on your cell phone. It gives you better reception. So it is interesting. And people do that. It's considered to be, do people believe in this? That question is, one would have to be really nuanced going about that question. So it's not as simple as some kind of meaningless superstition. But people consider that to be somewhat entertaining for them too. It's the right thing to do. There's a day in a year when this is what we do. Kind of like, when there is some kind of celebration in your town, you go to the town center, you see other people, talk to other people. That's what those temples are also. Right, that's what he's doing. He's blessing the country. Here you see one of those ropes. You see how giant this is? Look how small those people are. This is very big rope made from rice stalks. So it is to protect the shrine inside. And this is what people do in those shrines. You see those plaques here? So you can actually get those in shrine. And you can buy one that says things that you want, or you can have it inscribed, or you can inscribe it and then you can hang it here with your petition to the kami. What do you expect it to do? Some kind of protection and so on. And those come with, also those anime characters. It's so interesting. So people use them for all kinds of occasions. This is Amaterasu shrine, that main goddess, the goddess of the sun that I mentioned. Here is small, this is Kamidana, I mentioned. This is in the backyard of a restaurant. So you can see that's where those places, and you see foxes here also. So this is, what people would have in their homes. So this restaurant owner has that in his backyard, basically small Kamidana, and that's where you see those pieces of paper. They look kind of like maybe like stylized lightning bolt or something. These are origami, folded paper, but they came from the temple. That's what you go to temple to buy on a particular day, and then it is auspicious to bring that to your home and put it in your kamidana. People inherit those. Those are heirlooms, Some are super expensive, Buddhists do that too. So many Buddhist countries, people would have their Buddhist shrine in home. So those are very similar. Well, this picture, if nowhere else, you could see it in the Art Institute, right? They have many very good prints of Hokusai, the wave, and you can see what this is so famous, people appreciate it. But of course, it is about Mount Fuji, right? You can see fishermen, and you know that mountain is so high. It's an extinguished volcano, but it is so high that it always has snow on it. It's always white peak there. And then you know how big it is. But when fishermen are in the ocean, that wave, and that's the name of the painting, is the wave, actually dwarfs even Mount Fuji. So it is about very interesting kind of contrast. Mount Fuji looks so small you can barely see it. And for those fishermen, the wave is bigger than Mount Fuji. So power of nature also. It's very interesting. People like that painting. Here you have another. That's where worshipers would stand. You wouldn't see inside. So this rope tells you that beyond that rope is a holy space. This is my last slide, and this is what I was talking about. Here you have stylized images of the sun. Tori. By the way, Tori literally means bird perch. So it's a place where birds stand. And that's what those gates are. So that's why there's a bird here. And then cherry blossom. So you have those three aspects of the Japanese religion of Shinto. So cherry blossoms are about immense beauty that is also very temporal. If you cannot stop and appreciate it, if you see the cherry blossom and you say, oh, it's so nice, I'll go there and see it tomorrow, it's not going to be as good. So it is about fragility of beauty and of perfection, of the right moment to experience something. The sun, of course, is this big symbol of Japan also, and also the Japanese state, and it's on the flag and so on. And then you also have this gate, meaning you're entering something sacred. So, thank you so much for being patient to go with me over those things. I really appreciated it. It was really nice to get to know you. Thank you for inviting me. So, thanks.
You just know too much.
Oh, so the people hide all kinds of things in books, so I like to read and travel. So, any questions, anything specific for tonight? Yes?
Parsis, you mentioned, are they from Persia?
Yes.
Zoroastrianism?
Yes. So Parsi literally in Gujarati basically means people from Persia, Persians, right? So yeah, at one point, when Islam came to Iran, no, I mean, it was there already for quite some time. A group of people from Iran, where Zoroastrianism originated, moved to India. And they were given the right to settle there by local Raja, and they promised local Raja that they will never convert anyone on their religion. They just want freedom for their religion, and they were allowed to stay. So it created another kind of endogamic community. They only marry traditionally, they only stay within, they don't proselytize anyone. And so it is Zoroastrianism from India, it's called Parsism. And there's a nice temple, not too, well, it is maybe 45 minutes drive from here. There is Zoroastrian temple too. So in Zoroastrian temples, there is eternal fire, which is always, a kind of fire is a symbol of main divinity. I mentioned Zoroastrianism before. It's Ahura Mazda, kind of heavenly lord, who is worshipped in Zoroastrianism, and its presence is visible in fire that they worship. So those are called fire temples. And there's one in Chicago. Come on. It's amazing. Yes. And they are Parsi. Those people who worship there are mainly from India, Parsi people.